Okay, so picture this. You just helped win the biggest war in history. You're officially a world power. You'd think the next move would be to take a victory lap on the global stage, right? Well, for America after World War I, that's not what happened. Not at all. In a wild historical plot twist, the nation basically slammed the door on the rest of the world and turned inward. Today, we're going to figure out why. And this is really the core question of the whole decade. I mean, disillusionment, that's just a fancy word for when you expect one thing and get something much, much worse. So after this huge world-changing victory, why did an entire country feel so let down? Let's dig in and solve this puzzle. All right, first up, the Great War's hangover. Honestly, the best way to think about post-war America is like one massive national hangover. The victory party was over, and the morning after was rough. It came with all sorts of problems that nobody saw coming. Now, what's so wild here is the contrast. I mean, you look at the stats, and on paper, America should have been on top of the world. Europe was physically shattered, its economy in ruins, but the US? The fighting wasn't on our soil, and we'd actually made a ton of money selling supplies to everybody else. It really looked like we'd won both the war and the peace. But that's not the whole story, not by a long shot. Because lurking right under the surface, the economy was getting hit with some serious whiplash. Switching from a war economy back to a peace economy was just chaotic. Inflation was out of control, soldiers were coming home, and, surprise, there were no jobs for them. And then, bam, a huge recession hits, with prices dropping by more than a third. So for the average American, this so-called victory didn't feel very victorious. It just felt scary and really, really unstable. So what happens when a whole country is feeling sick and tired? It starts looking for a cure. And in the 1920s, the cure that was offered was a simple, incredibly powerful political promise. A promise to just make all the anxiety and chaos go away. And there it is, return to normalcy. That was the slogan that got Warren G. Harding elected president. And you can see why it worked. It was the perfect medicine for a country that was completely exhausted by foreign wars, international drama, and all this economic turmoil. But what did getting back to normal actually mean as a policy? In one word, it meant this: isolationism. The thinking behind it was super straightforward. Hey, all our problems started when we got tangled up in the world's problems. So let's just stop doing that. The plan was to pull back, focus on our own backyard, and let the rest of the world figure out its own mess. So if the diagnosis was too much world and the cure was isolationism, then the prescription they wrote was all about economics. The government's big idea was that the fastest way to feel normal again was to get back to business, plain and simple. This quote just nails the entire vibe of the era. The core belief was that if American companies are doing well, then America as a country will do well. So the government's main job? Do everything possible to help businesses succeed. And this all came together in a really clear economic strategy. First, step back from foreign affairs. That calmed down investors. Second, slash taxes, which gave people and companies more cash to spend. And third, slap these really high tariffs on foreign goods, which made buying American-made stuff a no-brainer. It was like they were building a protected, self-fueling economic engine. And a huge part of what was fueling that engine was technology. Get this, by the 1920s, a whopping 70% of American factories were running on electricity. Now, we're not just talking about light bulbs here. This was the power behind the assembly line revolution. This was the juice that let factories churn out consumer goods at a scale nobody had ever seen before. But you know how it goes. Every prescription has side effects. And the side effect of America turning inward was this deep, growing suspicion of everything and everyone from the outside world. And this led to a much, much darker side of the 20s. The name for this particular side effect is nativism. It's an old fear in American history, but it flared up with a scary new intensity after the war. The anxiety wasn't just about jobs anymore. It was a deep-seated fear that immigrants were bringing in radical foreign ideas, like communism, that could threaten the whole American way of life. And you can literally trace the path from how people felt to what the government did. First, the fear spreads, especially about immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Then, that fear fuels a really powerful political movement that gets a lot of traction. And finally, Congress listens and passes laws that basically close America's doors. And these were the laws that did it: the Emergency Quota Act and the National Origins Act. Now, these didn't just reduce the total number of immigrants, they completely changed who was allowed in. They set up these strict quotas based very specifically on where you were from, designed to heavily favor immigrants from Northern Europe while drastically cutting off almost everyone else. So, when we step back and look at the whole decade, what's the final diagnosis? What you find is a period of time that is just defined by one massive, powerful contradiction. The decade really had two faces, living side by side. On one hand, you had the Roaring '20s, the economic boom, jazz music, this incredible feeling of prosperity. But right next to it, you had the anxious '20s, deep social divisions, isolationism, and that widespread fear of outsiders. The really key thing to understand is that both of these realities grew from that exact same desire for a return to normalcy. Which leaves us with a pretty tough question to think about. This decade roared with progress, for sure, but it was also absolutely riddled with problems. So which one was it? Was it a great leap forward for the United States, or was it a time of anxious retreat? The answer, a lot like the decade itself, is anything but simple.